Step away from the vehicle, sir. That car doesn't belong to you. The voice cut across the quiet evening air of the downtown parking lot like a blade through glass, sharp enough to make several people turn their heads at once. The black luxury coupe sat under the pale glow of a street lamp, its polished surface reflecting the city skyline like a mirror, and beside it stood a tall man in a dark hoodie and simple jeans holding a key fob loosely in his hand. Darnell Williams didn't move. Not because he was frozen, not because he was confused, but because in that exact moment he understood something the officer standing across from him did not. Around them the parking lot hummed with the distant sounds of traffic rolling along the avenue 2 blocks away, a food truck generator rattling softly, the faint echo of music drifting from a nearby rooftop bar. It was a normal Friday night in the city, the kind of night where people hurried to dinner reservations or waited for ride shares under glowing neon signs. Yet suddenly every pair of eyes in that small corner of the lot drifted toward the same scene. A police cruiser idled at an angle near the entrance ramp, its headlights bright against the pavement. Officer Grant stepped closer, one hand resting near his radio, his expression already locked into certainty. "I'm going to ask you again," he said, voice louder now, the kind of tone meant to carry across a crowd. "Step away from the car." Darnell glanced down at the sleek black coupe beside him, the same car he had unlocked just seconds earlier with the key still in his hand. The soft interior lights had flickered on when he pressed the button. The mirrors had unfolded automatically, every sign that the vehicle recognized its owner. Still, Grant shook his head like none of that mattered. A valet attendant from the restaurant across the street stood a few yards away watching, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. Two women walking past slowed their steps, whispering to each other as one of them lifted her phone slightly, curiosity overtaking whatever plans they had a moment before. Darnell finally looked back at the officer, calm, composed, almost patient in a way that made the tension around him feel even sharper. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone used to rooms full of executives and board members, not parking lot confrontations. But tonight he looked like any other man leaving dinner in the city. No suit, no watch flashing under the lights, no entourage, just a hoodie, jeans, and a pair of clean sneakers. Officer Grant gestured toward the car again. "This vehicle was reported suspicious," he said. "And a car like this doesn't usually belong to someone standing where you are." The sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Darnell didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply turned the key fob in his fingers once, letting the small metallic click echo in the quiet space between them. Somewhere behind him a car passed on the street, headlights gliding over the asphalt for a brief second before disappearing again. The valet attendant shifted his weight like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure he should. And still, Darnell Williams remained exactly where he was beside the car that was very much his. Because what Officer Grant believed he was interrupting tonight wasn't a man stealing a car. It was the owner of something far bigger than the officer could possibly imagine. Officer Grant kept his eyes fixed on the man beside the coupe, studying him the way someone studies a puzzle they think they already solved. The headlights from the patrol car stretched across the asphalt, casting long pale lines around the polished body of the vehicle. The car itself was impossible to ignore. A deep black Aston Martin DB12, freshly detailed, its surface reflecting the glow of the city lights and the soft red of a traffic signal changing somewhere at the end of the block. Even parked, it looked expensive. The kind of machine people stopped to stare at when it rolled down the street. The kind of car that rarely appeared in a parking lot outside a restaurant unless its owner walked in wearing a tailored suit and a watch worth more than most people earned in a year. Darnell Williams still stood calmly beside it, the small key fob turning slowly between his fingers like a quiet metronome marking time. He had walked out of the restaurant less than 5 minutes earlier after finishing a late dinner meeting. The meeting had run longer than expected, but that was nothing new. When you ran a company that supplied vehicles, logistics systems, and fleet contracts across half the state, evenings had a habit of stretching past normal hours. Still, this particular dinner had been a small one. Just a quiet conversation about a new municipal contract. Nothing dramatic. Nothing public. No press. No announcements. Just a few executives discussing numbers over grilled salmon and coffee. Darnell preferred it that way. Quiet rooms. Real conversations. The valet station outside the restaurant had been nearly empty when he stepped onto the sidewalk. A cool breeze moved down the avenue, carrying the faint smell of roasted coffee beans from a cafe on the corner. The city moved the way it always did on a Friday night, fast but relaxed, taxis gliding past, pedestrians laughing as they crossed the street under the glow of neon signs. Darnell had nodded politely to the valet attendant who offered to retrieve the car, but he had declined with an easy smile. The vehicle was parked only about 40 yards away in the adjacent lot. A short walk, fresh air after a long meeting. He liked small moments like that, moments where he could move through the city unnoticed. Because most people who passed him on the sidewalk had no idea who he was, and that was often exactly how he wanted it. Tonight, he wore the same thing he had worn during the meeting. A dark charcoal hoodie, a pair of well-fitted jeans, and simple white sneakers. Comfortable, practical, nothing that shouted wealth or authority. If anything, he looked like a man finishing dinner after work. Not the founder and chief executive officer of Williams Automotive Group, a company that had grown from a small garage operation into one of the largest independent fleet suppliers in the region. 23 years earlier, Darnell had been 19 years old with grease on his hands and a borrowed toolbox in the trunk of a used sedan. Now his company manufactured and supplied thousands of vehicles to private security firms, logistics companies, and municipal departments across multiple states. Police departments included, but none of that was visible in a dimly lit parking lot at night. What Officer Grant saw instead was a man standing next to a six-figure car that did not match the story he had already written in his mind. The officer folded his arms slightly, still watching. "Let me make this simple," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet pavement. "Dispatch received a call about someone tampering with a high-end vehicle in this lot. When we arrived, you were standing here." The valet attendant shifted again a few yards away, glancing between the officer and Darnell like someone trying to decide whether to step into a conversation that had already gone too far. Two pedestrians slowed near the entrance ramp, their attention clearly pulled toward the scene. Darnell looked down briefly at the car, then back at the officer. The soft click of the key fob sounded again in his hand, and the Aston Martin responded instantly, its mirrors folding in and out with a gentle mechanical hum. Proof. Silent, simple proof. But Officer Grant did not even glance at the movement. His eyes remained fixed on Darnell's face. "Keys can be copied," the officer said flatly. "That does not prove ownership." The breeze shifted again, rustling a small stack of parking receipts near the pay station. Darnell exhaled slowly through his nose, not irritated, not defensive, simply patient in a way that made the entire moment feel strangely unbalanced. Because the officer believed he had already caught someone in the act of doing something wrong. And Darnell Williams knew that what was actually happening was something else entirely. Something he had experienced before in quieter forms throughout his life. A moment when a person looked at him, looked at what he had, and decided those two things could not possibly belong together. Officer Grant tilted his head slightly, as if the quiet confidence in front of him only made the situation more suspicious. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly above them, casting a pale yellow glow across the smooth pavement, while the black Aston Martin sat between them like silent evidence in a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided in the officer's mind. Darnell Williams remained exactly where he stood, one hand resting loosely near his pocket, the other holding the key fob that had already proven the car responded to him. The mirrors had folded once. The doors had unlocked once. The interior lights had glowed softly and faded again. But Grant had not looked at any of it. Instead, the officer shifted his stance and spoke again, louder this time as if volume could make certainty stronger. "I'm going to need identification," he said, "and proof that this vehicle belongs to you." The request itself was not unreasonable, but the tone carried something heavier than procedure. It carried assumption. Darnell studied the officer's face for a moment before slowly reaching into the back pocket of his jeans. The movement was calm, deliberate, the kind of motion that made it clear he had nothing to hide and nothing to rush. Around them, the small audience had grown. The valet attendant had stepped closer, standing near the curb with the uneasy posture of someone who wanted to speak, but was unsure whether doing so would make things worse. Two more pedestrians paused at the edge of the lot, whispering to each other as the glow from their phone screens lit their faces. A delivery driver in a white van slowed as he pulled into a parking space nearby, glancing through his windshield to see what was happening. The moment had begun to gather gravity. Darnell removed his wallet and opened it slowly, revealing a driver license that reflected the streetlight in a thin silver flash. He held it out toward Officer Grant without a word. Grant took the card and examined it carefully, his brow tightening slightly as he read the name printed across the front. Darnell Williams, he said out loud, as if testing the sound of it. His eyes flicked briefly from the license to the man standing in front of him, and then back again. Address checks out, he muttered, almost to himself. But instead of handing the license back, he glanced again at the car beside them. The Aston Martin gleamed under the lights, its long hood stretching toward the front of the lot like a piece of modern sculpture. Even parked it looked fast. Expensive. Out of place in a confrontation like this. Grant handed the license back slowly, but his expression had not softened. If anything, it had sharpened. Driver license proves who you are, he said flatly. It does not prove this car is yours. The sentence settled into the air like a stone dropped into still water. The valet attendant shifted again, clearly unsettled now. He had seen the man walk across the street only minutes earlier. He had watched him press the key fob and unlock the car. He had even heard the quiet chirp of the security system disengaging. But Officer Grant continued as if none of those details mattered. You would be surprised how often people stand next to cars that do not belong to them and claim otherwise, Grant said, folding his arms slightly. Darnell slipped his license back into his wallet and closed it with the same measured calm he had shown since the beginning of the encounter. He looked briefly at the Aston Martin again, then back at the officer. The city noise beyond the lot drifted toward them in waves. A distant siren somewhere several blocks away. Laughter from a group leaving the restaurant behind them. The low rumble of traffic passing through the intersection. Normal life continuing just beyond the edge of this moment. What exactly makes you think this car is not mine? Darnell asked finally, his voice steady and even. Grant did not hesitate. He gestured toward the vehicle with a short motion of his hand. A car like that usually belongs to someone different than the person I see standing here. The words were delivered casually, almost conversationally, but the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. The valet attendant looked down at the pavement, his jaw tightening as the implications settled into the air between them. Darnell did not react immediately. Instead, he turned the key fob in his fingers again and pressed the button once more. The Aston Martin responded instantly, the doors unlocking with a clean mechanical click and the headlights pulsing once in silent recognition of its owner. For a brief second, the entire parking lot seemed to pause. The car had spoken clearly, but Officer Grant still did not move. He stared at the vehicle, then back at Darnell, and shook his head slowly, as if the simplest explanation had already been rejected in favor of the story he preferred to believe. Officer Grant's eyes lingered on the headlights of the Aston Martin as they pulsed once and faded again, but the reaction he gave was not surprise. It was irritation, the kind that appears when reality refuses to follow the script someone already wrote in their head. The officer folded his arms and let out a short breath through his nose, as if the car responding to the key only complicated a story he had already decided to finish. Remote systems can be hacked, he said flatly, his tone carrying more certainty than evidence. The words drifted across the quiet parking lot and settled uneasily among the small crowd that had begun to form. The valet attendant finally took a cautious step forward from the curb, his voice careful but clear. Officer, I actually saw him unlock the car earlier, he said. His hand stayed raised slightly at his sides in the universal posture of someone trying not to create conflict. He came from the restaurant across the street. I thought he was one of the guests. Officer Grant turned his head slowly toward the young valet, his expression tightening. Sir, I did not ask for commentary, he replied, the sentence firm but controlled. The valet immediately shifted back half a step, glancing down at the pavement as though he regretted speaking at all. The moment hung in the air like a warning. Darnell Williams watched the exchange quietly, his face calm, but his eyes sharper now. The situation had moved beyond simple misunderstanding. Around them, the parking lot had grown noticeably quieter. The delivery driver who had pulled into the space nearby now leaned slightly out of his open window, curiosity overcoming whatever schedule he had been following earlier. Two women near the entrance ramp had stopped completely, their conversation forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. One of them held her phone low at her side, the screen glowing faintly. The city lights shimmered across the polished body of the Aston Martin as another car passed along the street beyond the lot, its headlights sliding across the pavement like a brief spotlight before disappearing again. Officer Grant stepped a little closer to the vehicle and looked it over with exaggerated attention, running his eyes across the sleek hood and the silver emblem on the grille. "A car like this costs more than most houses in this neighborhood," he said. The statement was not exactly a question, but the implication behind it was obvious enough that several people in the small crowd exchanged glances. Darnell remained where he was, his posture relaxed but deliberate. He had seen this kind of moment before in smaller ways throughout his life. A pause where someone measured him against what they believed belonged to a man who looked like him. Sometimes it came in the form of a skeptical glance in a dealership showroom. Sometimes it arrived in a quiet conversation where someone assumed he worked in maintenance rather than owning the building. The details changed, but the pattern rarely did. Officer Grant turned back toward him again. "I am going to run the vehicle identification number," the officer said. "Until then, I would prefer you remain right where you are." The request sounded procedural, but the phrasing carried the weight of a command rather than cooperation. Darnell nodded slightly, not out of submission but out of patience. "That is fine," he said calmly. The officer walked toward the front of the Aston Martin and leaned slightly to read the number through the lower corner of the windshield. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder as he spoke into it, relaying the digits to dispatch. The voice that responded on the other end was faint and distorted through the speaker, but the message was clear enough. Dispatch confirmed they were checking the registration. While the officer waited, the tension in the parking lot seemed to stretch. The valet attendant stood silently near the curb, his expression conflicted. The delivery driver remained half-turned in his seat, watching through the open window. The pedestrians near the ramp had moved closer now, drawn by the quiet gravity of the scene. Darnell Williams looked once more at the car beside him, then toward the officer standing at the front of it, and allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. Because what Officer Grant believed was about to confirm his suspicion was actually about to reveal something entirely different. Something the officer had not even considered when he first stepped out of his patrol car and decided that a man standing beside a black Aston Martin could not possibly be its owner. Officer Grant straightened slowly from the windshield after reading the vehicle identification number, the small reflection of the streetlight sliding across the glass as he stepped back. His radio remained clipped to his shoulder, its faint static whispering into the quiet air while dispatch processed the information he had just transmitted. The parking lot seemed to hold its breath. The valet attendant stood near the curb with his hands tucked nervously into the pockets of his uniform jacket. The delivery driver remained halfway out of his window, his curiosity now fully invested in whatever was about to happen next. The two women who had paused near the entrance ramp had stepped even closer, their conversation long forgotten as the moment unfolded in front of them. Darnell Williams remained beside the Aston Martin, calm and steady, the key fob still resting loosely in his hand. The city moved quietly around them. A taxi rolled past the corner. A distant horn sounded somewhere down the avenue. The ordinary rhythm of a Friday night continued just beyond the edges of this strange little standoff. Officer Grant placed a hand near his radio and waited. For him, the moment felt simple. Dispatch would confirm the registration. He would prove the man standing here did not belong with the car, and the situation would resolve itself the way he expected. But for Darnell, the silence carried a different weight. It reminded him of another night many years earlier when a similar pause had stretched across a very different street. He had been 19 years old then, standing beside a used sedan that barely started on cold mornings. The car had cost him almost every dollar he had saved from repairing engines in a small garage on the south side of the city. He remembered the smell of oil on his hands, the ache in his shoulders after long days of work, and the pride he felt the first time he held the keys to something that was finally his. But that night a patrol car had slowed beside him while he checked the engine under a street lamp. Two officers had stepped out and asked questions that sounded strangely familiar even now. Who owned the vehicle? Why he was standing beside it? Whether the keys were actually his. He had answered politely then too, explaining that the car was his and that the engine simply needed adjustment. Eventually the officers left, but the feeling stayed. The quiet understanding that sometimes a person could do everything right and still be treated like a problem that needed explanation. That memory flickered through Darnell's mind for only a second before fading again into the present. 23 years had passed since that night. 23 years of early mornings, late meetings, and risks that turned a small repair shop into Williams Automotive Group. Thousands of vehicles delivered. Hundreds of employees hired. Contracts signed with companies and municipalities across multiple states. Police departments included. Officer Grant shifted his weight slightly as the radio crackled again. The voice of dispatch began to come through, faint but clear enough to carry across the stillness of the lot. The officer pressed the button on his shoulder and leaned closer to hear the response. His expression changed slowly as the message continued. At first, there was only concentration as he listened to the numbers being repeated back to him. Then his brow tightened. The valet attendant noticed it first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the officer's posture shift. The delivery driver leaned further out of the window. Even the two women near the ramp glanced at each other, as if they sensed the moment turning. Officer Grant did not speak for several seconds after dispatch finished. The radio went silent again except for a low hum of static. Finally, he lowered his hand from the button and looked toward the Aston Martin once more, his eyes traveling across the sleek body of the car before returning slowly to the man standing beside it. The confidence he had carried earlier had faded just slightly, replaced by something less certain. Because the registration dispatch had just confirmed did not belong to the story he had expected to hear. The vehicle identification number had matched a registered owner, and that owner's name was already standing 10 feet away from him in the quiet glow of the parking lot lights. Officer Grant remained still for a moment after dispatch finished speaking, the quiet static of the radio fading into the night air as the words settled in his mind. The vehicle identification number had been confirmed without hesitation. The registration matched perfectly. Owner name on file, Darnell Williams. The officer lowered his hand slowly from his radio and stared at the car again as though the polished black machine might suddenly explain itself. The Aston Martin reflected the overhead light like a sheet of dark glass, elegant and unmoved by the tension surrounding it. For the first time since stepping into the parking lot, Grant's posture lost a fraction of its certainty. It was subtle, but the change was visible. The valet attendant noticed it immediately, his shoulders straightening slightly, as if the balance of the situation had begun to shift. The delivery driver leaned farther out of his window now, openly watching the exchange with the interest of someone who sensed the story had just changed direction. The two women near the entrance ramp exchanged a glance before focusing their attention back on the officer. Darnell Williams stood exactly where he had been since the beginning, calm and patient, the key fob resting quietly in his hand. The breeze moved gently through the lot again, carrying the faint sound of music drifting from the restaurant across the street. The city did not pause for moments like this. It never did. Officer Grant cleared his throat slightly, a small sound that broke the silence. Dispatch confirmed the registration, he said, though the statement sounded more like he was repeating the information to himself than announcing it to anyone else. His eyes moved back toward Darnell, studying him again with a different kind of scrutiny now. The assumption that had filled the officer's voice earlier had begun to thin, replaced by something closer to calculation. The facts he had just received did not fit the story he had started with. And stories like that did not unravel easily once someone had committed to them. Grant took a slow step away from the front of the Aston Martin and folded his arms again, trying to recover the authority he had displayed earlier. Registration shows your name, he said. But that does not always mean what people think it means. The words hung awkwardly in the air, even to those listening. The valet attendant blinked slightly, clearly confused by the explanation. The delivery driver frowned as if trying to understand how confirmation had somehow turned into more doubt. Darnell watched the officer without raising his voice or changing his expression. His calm had become almost disarming. What exactly do you think it means? Darnell asked quietly. Grant hesitated for half a second before answering. Vehicles get registered under business entities, the officer replied. Corporate fleets, rentals, leasing companies. Sometimes the name on paper does not match the person standing beside the car. It was a careful attempt to rebuild the argument, a way to keep control of a situation that had begun slipping through his fingers. But the explanation carried less confidence than before. Darnell nodded slowly as though he understood the logic being presented. "That is true," he said. His voice remained level, measured, almost thoughtful. The officer seemed relieved for a moment, as though agreement might stabilize the ground beneath the conversation. But then Darnell continued. "And in this case the vehicle is registered under a company," he added. Officer Grant lifted his chin slightly, sensing confirmation of his theory. "Exactly," the officer said quickly. "So until we verify the relationship between you and the registered owner, we still need to be careful here." The small crowd listened closely now. The valet attendant looked back and forth between the two men. The delivery driver shifted in his seat, clearly invested in how this explanation would end. Darnell Williams glanced once more at the Aston Martin beside him, its polished hood reflecting the soft glow of the streetlight. Then he looked back at Officer Grant with the same quiet composure he had maintained since the moment the patrol car arrived. "You are correct about one thing," Darnell said. "The car is registered to a company." Grant nodded slightly, his confidence returning for a brief moment. "That is what I thought," he replied. But Darnell's next sentence landed in the parking lot like a stone dropped into still water. "The company is Williams Automotive Group," he said calmly. The officer's expression did not change immediately, but the name lingered in the air between them. Several people in the small crowd recognized it instantly. Williams Automotive Group supplied vehicles across the entire region. Logistics fleets, municipal contracts, security vehicles, and equipment support for several city departments, including the police department standing in front of him. Darnell Williams slipped the key fob into his pocket and met the officer's gaze evenly. "And I am the person who owns it." Darnell Williams' words settled into the quiet parking lot with a weight that was impossible to ignore. The name Williams Automotive Group did not drift through the air like a random company title. In this city, it carried recognition. Contracts. Vehicles on the road every day with municipal decals on their doors. Fleet vans, security units, transport trucks, and patrol vehicles supplied through agreements that had been signed years earlier in conference rooms not far from where they were standing now. The valet attendant recognized it immediately. His eyebrows lifted as the pieces clicked together in his mind. The delivery driver sitting in the van whispered something under his breath that sounded a lot like realization. Even the two women standing near the entrance ramp exchanged another glance, the glow from one of their phone screens reflecting faintly across her face. Officer Grant, however, remained still. The officer's expression did not change all at once. At first there was only confusion, the brief pause of someone hearing information. That did not fit the picture they had built. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were trying to measure whether the statement was serious or simply another claim. "Williams Automotive Group," he repeated slowly. The name sounded different when he said it out loud. Less certain, less dismissive. The Aston Martin gleamed under the overhead lights as a car passed along the street behind them, the brief sweep of headlights moving across the pavement like a silent spotlight. Darnell did not rush the moment. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes spoke louder than explanations. The officer shifted his stance again and glanced briefly toward his patrol car as though searching his memory. The department vehicles parked at the precinct came from somewhere. The maintenance contracts came from somewhere. The new fleet that had been delivered only 6 months earlier had come from somewhere too. And the company name printed on the paperwork had sounded very familiar. Grant looked back at Darnell with a different kind of attention now. "You are saying you own the company," he said carefully. The question was no longer framed like an accusation. It was framed like verification. Darnell nodded once, simple and direct. "Yes," he replied. The officer let out a slow breath through his nose and glanced again at the Aston Martin. The sleek car suddenly looked less like a suspicious object and more like exactly what it had been the entire time. The personal vehicle of a man who could easily afford it. The small crowd had grown noticeably quieter now. The valet attendant shifted forward another step, curiosity fully replacing the earlier nervousness. The delivery driver leaned out of his window completely, resting his arm on the door as he watched. The tension that had once leaned toward suspicion had begun to tilt in a different direction. Officer Grant lifted his radio slightly, but did not press the button yet. His eyes remained fixed on Darnell. "If that is the case," the officer said slowly, then this situation might need clarification. The words were cautious, almost diplomatic compared to the sharp tone he had used earlier. Darnell reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not hurried, not dramatic, simply deliberate. The screen lit up softly in his hand. Clarification is not difficult, he said. He scrolled briefly through a few contacts before stopping. The name on the screen was Angela Carter, the chief legal officer of Williams Automotive Group. A woman who handled matters like this with the same precision she brought to corporate negotiations and city contracts. Darnell did not dial immediately. Instead, he looked back at the officer one more time. "You believe someone was stealing this car," he said calmly. Grant nodded once, unable to deny the statement. "That was the report we received," the officer replied. Darnell studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had experienced this type of misunderstanding before. "Reports can be wrong," he said. Then he pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before the voice on the other end answered. Angela Carter did not sound surprised. "Darnell," she said. "Is everything all right?" Darnell glanced briefly at Officer Grant before replying. "Not exactly," he said, "but I think the city police department is about to realize something important." The parking lot fell silent again as the weight of that sentence settled into the night air. Darnell held the phone calmly against his ear while the faint sounds of the city drifted through the parking lot around them. Angela Carter's voice remained steady on the other end of the line, the quiet confidence of someone who had handled complicated situations before. "Tell me what happened," she said. Darnell glanced briefly toward Officer Grant, who now stood with his arms folded, but with far less certainty than he had carried earlier. The officer's eyes moved between Darnell, the Aston Martin, and the small group of people watching the scene unfold. "An officer believed someone was stealing my car," Darnell said evenly. He called it in before confirming the registration. There was a short pause on the line, followed by the faint sound of Angela typing something into a computer. "The Aston Martin?" she asked. "Yes," Darnell replied. Angela's tone shifted slightly, not surprised but attentive. "I am looking at the registration now," she said. "Vehicle identification number matches our records. Registered to Williams Automotive Group under executive allocation." Darnell nodded slightly, as if Angela could see him through the phone. "Dispatch confirmed the same thing a minute ago," he said quietly. Officer Grant's posture stiffened at those words. The valet attendant watched the exchange closely, his curiosity now fully replacing the earlier hesitation. The delivery driver leaned his elbow on the edge of the van door and continued listening openly. Angela spoke again, her voice calm but precise. "Do you need me to contact the city oversight office?" she asked. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Even Officer Grant seemed to hear the weight behind it. Darnell looked toward the patrol car parked near the entrance of the lot, its headlights still casting a pale beam across the pavement. "Not yet," he said thoughtfully, "but it might be useful for the department to understand the situation clearly." Angela responded without hesitation. "The police department fleet contract is scheduled for review next quarter," she said. "I assume they would prefer that discussion begin without complications." The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Williams Automotive Group supplied a large portion of the city's municipal vehicles. The agreement had taken years to build, and it had placed thousands of vehicles on roads throughout the region. Contracts like that involved more than money. They involved trust. Darnell turned slightly and looked back at Officer Grant, who now seemed much more aware of the crowd that had gathered quietly around the lot. The officer cleared his throat again, his earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. "Sir," Grant said carefully, choosing his words with more precision now. "There may have been a misunderstanding about the report we received." Darnell lowered the phone slightly, but did not hang up. Angela remained on the line, listening silently. "A misunderstanding," Darnell repeated. The phrase echoed gently in the cool night air. The valet attendant shifted closer, watching the officer with interest. One of the women near the entrance ramp raised her phone slightly higher, though she kept the screen angled downward. Officer Grant looked toward the Aston Martin again before returning his attention to Darnell. "Dispatch informed me that the vehicle is properly registered," the officer continued. "I was responding to a call from a passerby who believed the car might be stolen." Darnell considered the explanation without interrupting. The breeze moved lightly across the parking lot again, carrying the distant sound of a train horn from somewhere beyond the river. The city continued moving around them, indifferent to the tension unfolding in this small corner of pavement. Reports can create assumptions, Darnell said finally. His voice was calm, but every word landed with quiet clarity. Officer Grant nodded slightly. Yes, sir, he replied. The difference in tone from earlier was impossible to miss. Darnell raised the phone again. Angela, he said, his eyes still on the officer. It appears the officer would like to resolve the situation. Angela's voice returned through the speaker, composed and professional. Understood, she said. But I recommend documenting the interaction. Situations like this tend to become important later. Darnell allowed a small pause before answering. That might be wise, he said. Officer Grant stood silently for a moment, the realization of what was happening settling slowly across his expression. The car had never been stolen. The man beside it had never been a suspect. And the company he had just questioned happened to be the same company responsible for supplying vehicles to the department he worked for. The quiet of the parking lot deepened after Angela's final words lingered through the phone speaker. For several seconds no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant rhythm of traffic moving through the city and the soft hum of the patrol car engine idling near the entrance ramp. Darnell Williams stood beside the Aston Martin exactly as he had from the beginning, calm and composed, while the realization settled across Officer Grant's face in slow, unmistakable stages. The officer had started the night believing he was stopping a crime. Now he understood he had interrupted the owner of the very company responsible for supplying vehicles to the department he served. Grant shifted his stance and looked briefly toward the patrol car as though hoping the moment might somehow reset itself. But the quiet attention of the small crowd around them made that impossible. The valet attendant remained a few steps away with his arms folded loosely, his earlier hesitation replaced by open curiosity. The delivery driver leaned comfortably against the door of his van now, watching with the relaxed patience of someone who knew the ending of the story had already begun to write itself. The two women near the entrance ramp had not moved either, their expressions reflecting the same realization spreading across the lot. Officer Grant cleared his throat and spoke carefully, every word measured in a way it had not been earlier. Sir, he said, addressing Darnell with a formality that had been missing at the start of the encounter. It appears this situation developed from an incorrect assumption based on the call we received. The statement was not quite an apology, but it was the closest he had come so far. Darnell lowered the phone slowly from his ear, Angela still listening on the line. He studied the officer for a moment before responding. Assumptions can be powerful, he said quietly. They can also be expensive. The sentence was delivered without anger, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. Officer Grant nodded once, the small motion acknowledging more than the words themselves. He reached for his radio again and pressed the button. Dispatch, he said. Situation resolved. Vehicle owner confirmed on location. The radio crackled softly with a brief acknowledgement from the operator before falling silent again. The moment seemed to shift as the officer lowered his hand. The authority that had once framed the encounter now felt smaller, replaced by the quiet understanding that the man he had questioned was not just another citizen in a parking lot. Darnell glanced briefly at the Aston Martin beside him, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like a calm lake at night. Then he spoke again, his voice steady and even. The report said someone believed a car was being stolen, he said. That happens sometimes. But what matters is what happens after the facts become clear. Officer Grant met his gaze, listening carefully now. The officer understood the difference between the two moments. The first had been driven by suspicion. The second required judgment. Darnell slipped the key fob back into his pocket and continued. You saw a man standing beside a car, he said. And you decided the man did not belong with it. The words settled heavily in the quiet lot. The valet attendant shifted slightly. The delivery driver nodded once under his breath, and even the women near the ramp seemed to recognize the truth inside the statement. Officer Grant did not argue. Instead, he stood still, absorbing the lesson unfolding in front of him. Darnell raised the phone once more. Angela, he said calmly. The situation is finished. Angela's voice came back through the speaker with the same composed tone she had carried throughout the call. Understood, she replied. Do you need anything further documented? Darnell glanced once more at the officer before answering. No, he said after a brief pause. The moment has already explained itself. He ended the call and slid the phone into his pocket. For a few seconds no one moved. Then Darnell reached for the Aston Martin's door handle and opened it with an easy motion. The interior lights illuminated the cabin softly, revealing polished leather and quiet engineering designed for people who understood exactly what they owned. Before stepping inside, he looked back toward Officer Grant one final time. "You believed you were protecting something tonight," Darnell said calmly. "But sometimes the real responsibility is recognizing who already built it." The officer nodded slowly, the meaning clear now in a way it had not been earlier. Darnell stepped into the car, the door closing with a quiet, confident click. Moments later the engine started with a low, refined hum, and the black Aston Martin rolled smoothly toward the exit of the lot, leaving behind a parking space that suddenly felt much quieter than before.